Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Enbridge supported building science session today. We'll give everybody a chance to get online here. Looks like we have quite a healthy registration for this afternoon. Interesting topic, without question. You will note that as you come on today that you have been muted. Stacy Cooper is running our building knowledge web admin in the background. So if you have technical questions, you can get a hold of her via chat. I'll give everybody just a few more minutes to come on. Hopefully all have had a good Thursday afternoon. I just noticed this morning as I was getting ready for this presentation, I happened to look out the window in front of me, and I hate to say this, but I think some of the leaves are changing. It's almost hard to forget sometimes that we have a full season of winter on its way, but what a good summer. All right. Well, Stacy and folks, welcome to this afternoon. We'll go ahead and get started with our webinar today. This is part of the Enbridge supported Advanced Building Science webinar series. Enbridge is the sponsor for these sessions. Enbridge, Susan and team have been a very good sponsor of the broader residential home building industry across Ontario for many years. Their Savings by Design program, I don't know how many hundreds of charrettes they've run under Savings by Design, and all of those charrettes eventually result in communities that are, low carbon, healthy, sustainable. So kudos to the help in those programs. Today, the topic is this new tiered energy code for Part 9 low-rise residential. It's called the National Building Code of Canada 2020-936. And today we have some really, I'm going to say thoughtful, smart, engaging guests with us to give us their opinion on sort of an Ontario perspective. I'm going to introduce you to those folks in just a minute as we get moving. Couple housekeeping rules for us this afternoon. If you have questions about the code or questions for the panelist as we get into this, please put those questions in the Q&A. We are going to try to make time at the end of the session today to get through the Q&A. If we can't get to all your questions at the end of the day, we'll try to get back to you or send you some sources that'll help. But as far as the chat goes, the chat is really there just for if you're having issues with Zoom or technical platform issues, get a hold of Stacy. I will encourage everybody to please, these sessions, everyone, yourselves included, that have attended have been very good to be thoughtful and considerate in the chat. Just remember that it is a public forum. These will be recorded. The notes will be made public. So let's be considerate, thoughtful, and respectful in the chat as well too. The mid team is behind you in case you need help. You are going to get a survey immediately following this today, and you will receive a copy of the presentation along with a recording. So don't worry about that. It's going to come your way after the presentation today, but we do need you to fill out the Survey Monkey. The Survey Monkey helps Enbridge and ourselves know what we need to be thinking about, how we can do things better, and other topics that might be helpful. Because as Enbridge and ourselves and others look ahead to this year and to 2023 and beyond, we would like to know what some of the other topical webinars might be of use to you folks. And again, links and presentation materials will come your way once the session is finished. The agenda for this afternoon is we'll be starting, we've got the housekeeping done, we've got the intro. We'll be spending about 20 to 25 minutes giving you a brief overview of this 936 and the Ontario perspective, because there are some differences. And then we're going to bring our panelists on, Mike Memme, Bob Schickedanz, Susan Cudahy. Luca Bucci, unfortunately, was not able to join us today. Something came up, so he's not able to join us. And then we're going to have a question and answer period. So as we get started, we're going to have you do a couple things for us real quick. Want you to test out your Zoom capabilities, and we're going to run a poll. So tell us very quickly where you're joining us from. Which province? If you're all from Ontario, that's great. If you're calling from other places, that's perfect too. If you're not on the list or you want to be detailed and tell us exactly the GPS locations of where you are, you can put it in the chat. But it's always helpful to us to sort of see where attendees are calling in from. Excellent. I think that's it. So we've got obviously lots of folks from Ontario. We've got a little bit of Quebec, some Atlantic provinces, Alberta, British Columbia. It's good to know where you're from. Just keep in mind, for those of you that are outside of the province of Ontario, there is a lot of content here today that is uniquely Ontario, but it is good to note that some of this 936/2020 does come from the National Building Code, which again, all the province and territories are looking at. One more little poll before we get started. What do you do? What keeps you busy day to day? What's your profession? What's your interest? And again, if you can't find a place on here, just throw it in the chat. Excellent. So we've got a number of probably 80 or so. We've got in the builder, renovator, developer space, some engineers, architects, some site construction staff, got some energy advising, qualified energy advisors, consultants, mechanicals. That's excellent. And like I said, if there's some of you that if your profession doesn't fit in here, just put it in the chat for us. So good. Thanks, Stacy. Good. So majority are builders, developers. Excellent. All right, so I'd like to again thank Enbridge, who is the sponsor of the session today. If our panelists want to briefly throw their cameras on real quick, we'll do some introduction. We have Bob Schickedanz. Bob is president of the Ontario Home Builders and the owner of Farsight Homes, a long-standing Ontario builder and a no question leader in their industry. Bob, it's great to have you on today.
Glad to be able to participate, Andy. Good afternoon to everybody.
Very good. We have Susan Cudahy as well. Susan is supervisor of strategic builder relations with Enbridge Gas. Many of you will know Susan because she's been doing a lot of training these days on Enbridge webinars. It's good to have you today, Susan.
Andy. Hey, Andy, thank you. Finally got off mute and started the video. So thank you everyone for participating today. We really appreciate it. Look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Susan. And Mike Memme, operations manager at Mountainview Building Group. Mike, again, longstanding leader in the industry, currently acting as chair of the Ontario Home Builders Association Builder and Developer Council. I remember when I was a builder and I got interested in building science, and I met this guy named Mike Memme in like 2004, 2005, and we spent 2.5 to 3 hours talking building science in a restaurant. Like, Mike, good to have you on today.
Thanks, Andy. So great to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Excellent. So thank you, folks. So we're going to bring you back on shortly, but for the next 20 minutes, we're going to hop on and we're going to take a look at this tiered energy code. All right, so my name's Andy Oding. I'm president at Building Knowledge Canada. I do have to just share that I do sit on a number of committees at the Canada Codes and some of the standing committees. So any of the content that you see today or any of the opinions that I have or this session today, they are not reflective at all of the NRC or of any of that committee work. This is purely just building knowledge with partner Enbridge, talking to leaders in the home building industry. So let's step back in time, and it's always good to put some context around what we're talking about today. And the one thing I like to remind everybody is that when this tiered energy code was developed, it was very explicitly purveyed to the standing committee and to the development of the code that it was to be about the reduction of energy, not the reduction of carbon. Carbon obviously is coming in the future, but for now, it was simply the reduction of energy. The other thing too was that it was to be about energy neutrality. In other words, the purpose was not specifically to electrify everything or what have you, but it was to be energy source neutral. So this gives you a little bit of insight as to the fundamental or the bedrock principles that were brought to bear in developing this tiered energy code. This is a brief look of, the original conceptual increases in efficiency, starting with, some of the original NBC 936 2015, that by the time we would get to this notional tier 5, at some point, it would be a 70% reduction, or you would have these houses that would have 26 to 32 gigajoules of energy. All I'm going to tell you about a house, folks, if you had a house that was 26 to 32 gigajoules of energy, gas and electrical all included, and it could be gas or electrical or a little bit of both, you're probably going to need about 7 to 6 kilowatts of PV on your roof to offset any of the energy use, hence why it's sort of net zero ready. Now, the other thing though too is keep in mind is tier 4 and tier 5 are very close to net zero ready. The other thing to keep in mind is that the National Building Code, when it comes to the energy efficiency of houses and small buildings, is already at use in most of the provinces. In fact, the only 2 provinces that have their own energy code up until this point were Ontario and Quebec. And then British Columbia has their STEP code, which is a mix of NBC 936 with their own language and targets on top of it and their own protocols on top of it. So really the biggest change across Canada may be for Ontario and for Quebec in some ways. The other thing too that I like to remind folks is as the Ontario as a province looks at harmonization efforts, this harmonization was indeed different than just a typical code development cycle. This is actually part of the reconciliation agreement on construction under the Canadian Free Trade Act. And again, you can imagine why this would be. So for instance, when we have manufacturers, when we have service individuals that are trying to build buildings or provide products for houses and buildings, and they have to meet a different code in every province, it's frustrating. Not only that, it limits innovation. We have run into scenarios here at Building Knowledge where, we would love to have other products brought into the province and used, but there simply isn't enough uptake because we're still, for instance, the entirety of Canada is a smaller industry than the state of California. So again, that's one of the key things around harmonization is to try to break open some of the barriers to the industry. So some of these tiers, notionally, this is out of the reference document today. A couple key things to explain is that in this new tiered code, there's actually for every home, there's going to be 2 targets. One is going to be an envelope target and the other is going to be a total energy target. So the total energy target is the efficiency of both the mechanicals and the enclosure, whereas the envelope target is the efficiency of the envelope alone. In other words, we can't just meet the increasing tiers of efficiency through solar panels and air source heat pumps. We also have to reinforce the passive measures, better windows, better air tightness, better insulation as we move forward. Ontario today sits at about tier 2. The 2017 SB 12 sits at approximately where the new tiered energy code tier 2 would sit. Any of the builders in Ontario, which I think last figures I looked at were about 22% of all housing starts in Ontario were Energy Star certified. Those homes that are Energy Star are already around the tier 3 mark. Ontario has proposed at this point in time, again, proposed, and they're still going through consultation with the industry on this. They're proposing harmonization at around tier 3. So that would mean a slight jump, let's call it a 10, 15, 20% jump for the industry to move ahead to this new tier 3. Now, we often get the question, sorry, my slides sort of ran together here. We often get the question from builders and clients and others, what happens now? Now that we have these tiers and we've got this supposed path that takes us to net zero ready, what next? Is that the end? And unfortunately, folks, or fortunately, depending on where you look at it, it's not. In fact, it's only the beginning. One of the things that we do see coming, and it's not just in Canada, it's in the rest of the global community, is that the energy reduction of the National Tiered Energy Code is an effort of 2020 to 2025, and it's already released. The work that's already begun now for the 2025 National Code is around energy reduction in existing homes and buildings. And you can imagine how complicated that will be, and some work around starting to reduce operational carbon. Beyond that, there are already groups starting to research or look into how does resiliency tie into the building codes. And then of course we have this question of what about embodied carbon? We're going to talk about that. So all I'm saying is for the next several years, in fact, for most of our lifespan, we have some of the most challenging times in front of us because of this thing called climate change and of course, changing societal behaviors and challenges. So some of the observations, and again, this is just the opinion of building knowledge, not the opinion of any of the ministry or any of the NRC staff, is the ministry has indicated that they intend to harmonize with the National Building Code, this new 936, 18 to 22 months from date of publication. So this would place potential adoption 2024 to 2025, somewhere in there. One thing we always like to remind folks is that the National Building Code does not address the administration of the code. In other words, the inspection protocols or the jurisdictions and how it's administered in the province. That is alone the responsibility of the province, not at the federal level. So that conversation still remains at the provincial level. A couple other things too, as air tightness is not mandatory. Again, in my opinion, I find this a little disturbing that we as Canadians would think that we can continue to insulate homes and yet not protect walls from interstitial condensation by having better air barriers, but that's just my opinion. It's not required. However, what you will find is that you probably get some of the biggest bang for your buck in decreasing energy efficiency by doing air tightness testing. There is credit given to smaller homes. So homes that are of 300 cubic meters or less, there are reduced targets. What is a 300 cubic meter? You know, I'm still trying to get my head around imperial versus metric, but it's a home that's probably about, let's say, 750 square feet on a townhome, 1,300 square feet in total. There's different metrics for those homes that are smaller, because smaller homes by their very nature can also be very efficient by nature of the design. There's also another little metric, and I say little, but it is very important to understand, is that in this new building code, there is a new cooling load metric. In other words, the proposed home that a builder designs or architect or client designs, the proposed home to be built, the cooling load cannot exceed the load of the reference house. So what this is trying to address, wrongly or rightly, is the good old cheat, if I can just be blunt, that you could take a house or a large tower downtown Toronto, layer it with glass, let in all the heat in the world so it looks like there's no need for heating in the winter, and you get a better energy score. And what that's trying to do is to offset trying to use solar gains to show benefit on heating loads, and is trying not to take it away, but to minimize it a bit, because what we're finding is that cooling loads are the growing concern amongst Canadians. In fact, it's cooling loads and the ability to cool homes that are having some of the biggest health impacts on Canadians, i.e. the BC heat dome event, some of the things we've seen this last summer and otherwise. Occupant loads, this is another note, the occupant load. So aside from space heating, hot water heating, and ventilation and domestic hot water, occupant loads have been taken out of the calculation. And the reason is they're too big now. They represent about 50 to 70% of the total energy use in a house. The problem is that the builder and designer have very little control over it. It's lifestyle. It's my wife and I and our family. It's our hot tubs. It's the Xboxes, things like that contribute, and lifestyle. There are more options, is sort of a good news under this new NBC 2020 than the SB 12. There's more options to meet it as far as pathways to get there. And the other thing too is that drain water heat recovery, unlike the SB 12, is not mandatory in the prescriptive measures, nor is it mandatory in performance options. However, it could provide good benefit towards meeting these measures and be well used under the performance path. A couple other things to keep in mind. When the ministry did put out this for public review, and they are still in the consultation stage, they did identify, in fact, that they intend to harmonize with Tier 3. And I believe the language was that they are targeting tier 3 to the exclusion of all other tiers. In other words, the other tiers are not recognized, simply tier 3. And we'll talk about maybe why that's important in just a bit. Air tightness. Ontario took the 936 National Building Code 2020, and they said, listen, we've seen what has happened with the 2.5 assumed reference in 936. We know, in fact, in Ontario that the real air change of standard homes is 3 for a detached and 3.5 for an attached. So they're keeping the SB 12 reference air tightness measures in place. So that is one difference, and something that, quite frankly, in my opinion, I would encourage other provinces to consider as well, because this is actually based on a lot of good data. Again, no mandatory drainware heat recovery. And the other thing too that maybe to think about is maybe there could be some additions. Again, they are in consultation with the industry. There might be some other recommendations the industry could make, like maybe there could be some packages developed in the appendix or something like that, if packages would be helpful. So in 936, there are 3 ways to meet this tiered energy code. There is a prescriptive path. And it's like Ontario has package A1 through A6. You don't need an energy advisor. You don't need a blower door test. Anybody on your staff can do this. They can pick A1 through A6, or in this new code, they can pick points. So instead of having a list of packages, what you have is points. So a R22 wall might get you 4 points out of 20. A tri-pane window might get you 10 points out of 20. You can pick your points off the pick list and then go apply for a building permit. So there is prescriptive allowed, it's just done differently. There is a new allowance as well, that if you want to use the EnerGuide label, there is the ability simply to model the home in the EnerGuide program, get a label, and as long as your home meets the embedded reference house for the building code, you can achieve it. The third metric is similar but different, and this is where you can use a third-party energy model. Again, it can be HOT 2000, it can be a number of others, PHP or what have you, as long as they are ASHRAE 140 certified, and as long as you follow the protocols 936.5, you can model a reference house as 936.5 shows you, and your proposed, and as long as you meet the percentages better, you should be good to go. And again, with the caveat that it's done by a qualified professional. I do want to give you a little brief look of what Ontario has proposed. So you can imagine there's tier 3. They've proposed at this point in time that it, under prescriptive, that it would take 20 points. So let's pretend you're a builder in Ontario and you're trying to get your 20 points on the house to apply for building permit. Well, you would then go to the window section and you would start to look at windows and look at that. If you have Energy Star windows, which most builder in Ontario's do, their U value of 1.4, not much different than what the building code is today, you would, for all practical intents and purposes, actually get about 3.6 points in zone 5, which is around the Toronto area. If you put tri-pane windows in the home that are a 1.2 or better, you can get 7 points, let's say, for your windows in the home. Air tightness also has prescriptive points available as well too. So if you hit 2.5 air change on a single detached home, you get 3.4 of your 20 points. If you hit 1.5, you get 10 of your 20. If you hit 0.6, something that would be close to a passive house, you get 13. And again, it varies depending on the climate zone that you're in. Wall assemblies, again, we'll make these slides, we'll share them with you. You can chew on them, you can cut them up, you can try them out yourself, but just for notional purposes, the above grade wall in the Toronto area, zone 5, what have you, an R22 wall with no continuous exterior is going to get you maybe 1.4 points. If you put R5 on the outside, you're going to get 5.4 out of your 20. If you do an R22 with R5, you go to 6 points. Interesting, just a little bit different. If you go to 2 inches, R10 on the outside, you get basically 10 of your 20. So what does a tier 3 home look like in a couple of years? Someone asked me, I think I was talking to Mike earlier, that's on, and he said, are we going to have foam on our walls in tier 3? And the answer is maybe. It's if you pick it as an option, you can use it. You might decide not to do R5 in the wall and do 1.5 air change. So where are you going to spend your money? Where are you going to spend your efforts? So R60 in the attic, not too much different than today. In this package, the builder picked a 2x6 wall with R5. Below grade, they're having to do a little bit more than just R20. Remember, the standard home in Ontario today that is built, 20 to 25% of the heat loss still remains below grade. No under slab at tier 3, really we're not seeing any requirements. Windows, you might want to start thinking about triples. However, a number of windows at 1.4 double pane are still going to be okay. Air tightness, you might want to take some points for 2.5 air change. What is your furnace going to look like, or heating system? Well, typically what you have now, 96% efficient ECM motor, HRV or an ERV. Hot water, you're probably going to have to start to bump the hot water up from, what I think the lowest allowable is a 0.67 or a 0.8. You're probably going to have to get into something that's a little higher efficiency. Drain water heat recovery, to be determined. You may or may not use it. Pick whatever you like. Now, I do want to show the difference between tier 3 and net zero ready real quickly. You'll see that in red, these are the items that basically make the difference between tier 3 and tier 4. It's getting into the under slab insulation. It is better air tightness. It's getting into 1.5 inches to 2 inches on the wall and getting into air source or dual fuel type systems in the home. One thing I do want to point out, though, we get a lot of questions about tier 5, and a little cautionary tale, and this is just our opinion, is when you look at tier 5, one of the things you're going to notice is it takes a lot of money and effort to go from tier 4 to tier 5. Tier 4 is essentially net zero ready when you look at those homes. Tier 5, not so sure what to think about it. A tier 5 home looks an awful lot to us like something that would be like a passive house. Now, here's the issue. Here's a typical home in Ontario, $16,000 simply to go from tier 4 net zero ready to tier 5. And what do you get? Well, you get $150 of electrical savings, and oh goodness, you get 0.04 tons of greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So again, we have to be careful about some of these tiers, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. The other thing too to keep in mind is this is a little report that came out by NRCan and the Endeavor Center a little while ago, and not many people are familiar with this. I'd encourage you to go look at it. They looked at some of these higher tier homes, in particular tier 4, tier 5, and some of the hires, and found that if we're not careful, we could end up building very energy efficient homes, but we inadvertently would be raising carbon emissions because the materials we use have high embodied carbon. And right now we do know pretty clearly that embodied carbon, that's the carbon that's in the materials, is almost equivalent to the carbon that's emitted by the home. And that's only looking at the embodied carbon that is in the raw supply in the manufacturing, which is called cradle to gate. That's not even taking into account the embodied carbon around the construction activities, the maintenance, or the complete life cycle. There is a nice little tool that Natural Resources Canada, CanMet, has developed where you can do embodied carbon studies on homes. Companies like Building Knowledge and ClearSphere and ANJ, they all have access to this. They can help with that, let us know. But you can look at a house and find out where is the embodied carbon. On this house that was modeled 2,500 square feet, you can see that a lot of the carbon was in the concrete. So simple change your supplemental cementitious mixture. On a house, here's a single detached home. The builder says, I need to lower carbon. What do I do? Well, I can take the house, which the total carbon, both the operational and the embodied, is 114 tons. Now, how do I lower that carbon? Well, you could lower it by 25 tons by just making the house more airtight. You could lower it by 12 tons by electrifying your hot water. You could put R40 to 80 in the attic, but it's only going to be 2 tons over 30 years. But look at the bottom one, 15 tons, more so than electrifying your hot water, 15 tons of carbon reduction just by changing to 20 to 30% supplemental cementitious mixture, blast furnace slag, rice hull, anything like that. Lafarge, St. Mary's, they all have these. And the beauty of that last one is that is the carbon that is there day one. Very, very impactful. So again, let's just think about these upper tiers. There's lots of communities out there that have moved ahead to net zero ready, tier 4 or so on. But one thing we do want to remind ourselves is it took a lot of these developers almost 15 years of combined R&D, and we're still learning. You know, oftentimes we look around Ontario and folks point out these absolutely sparkling examples of net zero communities. The thing we need to understand is that was 3 to 10 years in the planning stage for a lot of this work. So the point here is it doesn't happen overnight. We also have community energy plans. And often the confusing part of some of the community energy plans is they have good intentions, but they're not just energy, they talk about carbon. So we have to be careful of these unintended consequences of pushing energy reductions to, say, higher tiers, but at the same time, our embodied carbon could go through the roof. We need to look at it through a balanced approach is really what we need to do. So again, be careful of getting tunnel vision. We use this example even on our own team. We have to remind ourselves, don't just look at the future of homes through the lens of just carbon reduction or just energy. We have to look at it through the lens of building science, because what we don't want is unintended consequences. You know, we were reminded again recently at one of the National Code Interaction Collaborative meetings that as we move forward with energy efficiency and increase insulation, air tightness, and the other things, we continue to put the homeowners at more risk if we don't use good building science. Okay, now Canadians have a rich history in this, but sometimes we forget what we've learned. I'll go back to the air tightness thing. Folks, we need to remember that the reason we have air barriers in our building code is not simply because of energy, but the principal reason Canadians wrote air barriers into the building code was to limit interstitial condensation. That is the number one reason. And now we think that we're going to put insulation in homes up to tier 5 and not make air tightness a mandatory requirement. It's just silly. It's like forgetting the building science a little bit. Anyways, some of the other things too to keep in mind, we're going to get onto our panelists in just a minute here. You know, we've run into some lessons learned by the Canadian home builders. They've been looking after a number of net zero communities, but one of the things they pointed out is there's a lot of work to be done yet. Net zero communities, tier 4, tier 5 communities are fine for aspirational goals, but these low load homes start to change peak loads. You can imagine if a developer decides they want to build a development of 100 to 1,000 tier 4, tier 5 homes, and they electrify the homes. All of a sudden, that electrical utility is going to see a 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock peak load for hot water in showers. That is a load that not many utility companies understand, nor do they see right now. Battery storage is something that may need to come into place. Grid interactivity, that type of thing. The last one too is there has been no mechanism given to the home building industry, nor the construction industry, from the lenders, the banks, or the financial institutions to incentivize or recognize energy efficiency in new homes. This is in place in the US for even Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac mortgages, but it is not in place in Canada, and it's a poor reflection of us when we want to try to incentivize and recognize better practice. So this is something that someone should take away and start working on. I'm going to just sort of leave it there. I'm going to have our panelists actually come on, and we're going to get into some questions. One of the things we often say, and I'll position this to Bob and Susan and Mike as they come on, is, you know what, we've got a perfect storm coming, and it's going to affect affordability. We've got land availability issues. We've got labor and materials. We've got everything else. And on top of it, you folks still have customers that you have to deal with, right? And not they have to deal with, it's you and I moving into our homes, and the homes are changing. They're becoming more expensive and maybe becoming more complicated. So some of these things we're going to ask you. So, you know, how do you deal with some of these things? So Bob and Mike and Susan, maybe I'll have Bob start us off with this. The first question we sort of posed to our panelists today was these proposed code changes that are happening, do you think they're going to happen? And from your perspective, you folks have been working collaboratively with officials and others. When do you think some of these things might be adopted? Bob, do you have a sense of this?
Well, I think first off, to answer the question, Andy, is yes, the code changes will happen. The more important question actually is what will they actually look like, since we're in a, you know, still developing some of them and in consultation period right now. So that's a real question. And as you laid out in your presentation, in my understanding, initially the harmonization and in particular the drive to 936 I think the timeline was to have that ready and rolled out by 2024. And there's still ongoing consultations within Ontario at this juncture in terms of the details there. So, and they hope to have something out to the building community for consideration and preparation early in 2023, which, and we're already, on the doorstep of September. So those timelines I feel are really aggressive. I know maybe Mike and Susan may have some thoughts on that, but the change is going to come. What the extent of the change is really the question at this juncture, and how quickly will it be dropped on our lap? They have an aggressive timeline. I don't believe that that could be met. That's just, again, my personal opinion, because it's a real challenge when you consider how long it took to adapt previous code cycle changes.
Yeah, I do. I want Mike to chime in here in a minute, but you just made a point, Bob, about previous code changes. I think I remember, back when the 2006 SB 12 was started to be formulated, and the idea was 2006. And ultimately, because of learning and everything else, it wasn't until 2012 they were able to sort of dive into it. It took time for the industry to adapt. Mike, what do you think?
Well, I think the original agreement to harmonize was signed by the PC government in Ontario. And with them winning an election recently with a majority government and early in their mandate, harmonization is going to happen. You started your session, Andy, talking about the reasons for harmonization. There's lots of wonderful reasons to do it. I think that this is something that, it's part of their mandate and it's going to go through. The question is, what exactly is going to be harmonized and how fast? And there's so many components that make this all up. The majority of your presentation was about the difference between Section 936 in the National Building Code and SB 12 in the Ontario Building Code, how they're very different. And once 936 is adopted, what's involved there for us. But this is the entire code. So it's not just low-rise residential construction. It's part 3 of the code. It's everything. Right. And, in the consultations with the ministry, they've kind of broken apart the items that need to be reviewed and discussed for harmonization into 3 primary categories. They've got what they call low impact existing variations, which are, there's hundreds, if not thousands of them, slight word tweaks on multiple items in the code. I think we're going to be seeing the majority of those going through in this cycle. Then there's the Ontario only changes. There are multiple items in the Ontario Building Code that don't even exist in the National Building Code. We haven't really, SB 12 is one of them, but we didn't get into many of the other ones. But when there's a coroner's inquest, often it may lead to a code change in Ontario that's not reflected nationally. And then I think what's most interest to this group are the technical variations, things like SB 12 versus 936. So, undoubtedly, these changes are going to happen. We as an industry have to figure out what they mean for us and talk to government to say, yes, we can work with this. It's not so bad. Maybe it's very challenging and difficult and needs to be held off, like these energy ones. That's where you focus the whole presentation on. Should we be lobbying that SB 12 be maintained for this cycle and that not be changed till the next cycle? Okay. We're having the conversations on these things right now. Be prepared, though, that you're going to be updating your plans, your permit applications in 2 years from now to deal with them, with the majority of these changes. And the other thing, I'm sure it'll come up in other questions, but we haven't even talked about BCIN stuff. We haven't talked about the EADS form and all these kinds of things.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. No, absolutely. And we're going to dive into some of that in just a minute, Mike. So keep that in your hat. Susan, do you have anything too, from your perspective, working with builders, working with developers, any sense or any thoughts you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, from an Enbridge standpoint, our focus has really been the demand side management, or the DSM side, and where the goal is really to do the pre-prep to make sure that the builders, the HVACs, the developers have that advanced opportunity to learn, so that when these code changes happen, that they're already there. that they're not hit like a tsunami with the new information. So really at this point, what we've been doing in the preparation for our next round of demand side management programming is making the assumption that the proposed code changes are going to happen, that they will more than likely come in at the the step 3 level, which is by and large equivalent to the Energy Star version 2017, and that programming that needs to be ready and available for our builders to get them prepared is based on that as a reality. I know, as both Bob and Mike said, there's still lots of discussion happening out there about what it's actually going to look like, but for the purposes of preparation, that's that's really the angle that we're taking, is let's see what we can get into market to make sure that people are prepared for step 3, that it's going to be coming in 2024, 2025.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. That is an interesting perspective, Susan. You folks have an eagle eye view of sort of where the industry is too. So let's get a little more detailed here, and I'll just open this up and won't pick on anybody, but any comments on some key concerns or challenges that you just want to highlight? Again, Mike, I know you've probably got a laundry list, and Bob's probably going, where do we start, Andy? But just give me one or two, some key things. So
I'll start, Andy, on that one.
Yeah.
I think maybe the key thing for Ontario, there's a huge mental shift that we have to make, that the way that codes are developed and how they're going to affect builders in Ontario is going through tremendous change. We are used to sitting down with MMAH, looking at a group of proposed code changes, getting in a room with the Chief Building Officials Association, engineers, architects, people in the fire, and going through items one by one and talking about concerns and coming up with conclusions on what we think should be a recommendation for a code change, sending that to MMAH, who's sitting there listening to this entire conversation. And I think we've developed an excellent code through that process. There are things that have been happening at the national code level, like depending on the distance of a house from a fire truck station, that will determine how much glass you can put on the side of a house. And we just, I'm not sure I think that got in, and these things are happening and we're ignoring them. We're not worrying about it. That's those guys. Well, now that's us. And, our biggest challenge, I think, is how do we become part of helping get the codes right? Because now we're sitting in a room with the other provinces, not just builders from Ontario, but builders from across Canada. Do we have a voice at the table? Are Ontario's concerns even going to be addressed? We've got all these unique things in the code which are excellent and reflect the reality of building in Ontario. Many builders in Ontario are going to tell you that the national code should be harmonizing with the Ontario code, not the other way around. But that's right.
And what we don't know really does make us afraid. That's right.
Absolutely. But for our industry, how do we be involved to make sure that the codes work?
Yes,
that's the biggest challenge.
And I'm going to add to that too. And again, this is just my observation, but one of the things I have seen is all of us, whether we are builders, homeowners, code officials, engineers, architects, or industry members, have had 3 years to struggle to keep up with life as it is. The ability to even attend code meetings, the ability to keep up with changes in the midst of everything we faced has made this tremendously difficult. Sometimes you have to take a little bit of a breather. We've seen that even as a business. You have to understand that we've lived in a world now for 3 years where we've had to sort of go, hold on a minute, let's get this right. So, yeah.
Andy, maybe I'll just jump in because I'm sure Bob's got some great comments to make, but just from what we're hearing from our builders and developers is that, I think the number one issue is still affordability. And what is the impact on all of these changes on the critical issue of affordability? which is only becoming more advanced as we look at, the issues of mortgage rate pressure and all the rest of that that's starting to come into play. And we also hear very much the challenges of, we don't have enough people. We don't have the capacity. Our trades aren't ready to be able, they're not trained. They don't understand how to do these things. We need time. And that so many of our people that are sort of that top line trade experience are retiring. So it's getting the industry capacity built up with the guys and the girls that can do the blower door tests right across the province, that have the ability to, to access an energy advisor, to get the help. It's, do we have that foundation in place to help them be successful, or are they going to face it alone? I think those are some of the things that we're seeing right now. And last but not least is, the focuses that are coming at the municipal level, where an awful lot of the municipalities right now, regardless of building code changes, are undertaking, implications of, let's go to step 4 or 5 right at the onset so that we can have that advantage. What that impact could happen at the municipal level with the incoming code are all things that we're hearing the builders concerned about just on the street these days.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll turn it over to Bob actually at that point.
Okay, well, we could talk all afternoon about challenges, and Susan and Mike certainly touched on some of the highlights. Andy, you mentioned earlier in your presentation here, unintended consequences. Be a concern and challenge too, because we're I call it rushing to meet a certain standard and want to get there, but have all the building science people being able to vet out properly that the house is now to work as a whole system, right? And are we confident when we get to the implementation stage, this is actually going to work without those unintended consequences? So, I mean, we need to not necessarily say take a pause, but we need to be aware that what we're implementing has, long-term sustainability.
Yeah. House is a system. Yeah. And Susan certainly touched on, the capacity of the industry to implement, and I won't go into that. Labor, builders, inspection. Do we have inspectors that are educated to do all of this? To build up that capacity certainly takes time. Affordability, she mentioned, and yes, communities design. So we're talking about house right now, but in these, as Susan alluded to, is not only the green standards that many municipalities pushing towards that incorporate house design and building standards, but community design standards. And actually, the industry right now is designing the communities that we're going to put shovels in the ground maybe in the next 5 to 10, 15 years. And some of these, so if you want to achieve something in that time frame, we need to know what the parameters are. And quite frankly, when it comes to community design, there's very little, and it's kind of the adage, industry go in a corner and you guys figure it out. Well, we have to know what sort of infrastructure. Is there going to be natural gas? You mentioned the electrical loading. All these things we have to plan today, because it takes such a long time, first of all, to go through the planning process and the design process to the implementation. So while we're not hesitant to move towards greener standards and more energy efficiency, the industry is all on board with that, but it's got to be done in a thoughtful way that we can achieve those goals. I love it. By the way, I want you, Mike and Bob and Susan, if you can, look over in the chat. We've got some really good comments. Mike Leo is asking some good questions. Mike Sealing, number of others, and I'm going to have everybody, if you can put some questions too over in the Q&A, that would be great. But a lot of things that they're asking are and saying support what you're doing as well. It's not for lack of will.
No.
And you look at, like I said, 20% of the starts in Ontario, the home builders are already doing a lot of these things in a voluntary nature. They're already doing things like exterior insulation and blower door testing without anybody telling them they have to. But we also know, as Canadians who have some of the best principles of building science from 50 years in a cold climate, that if you don't do things in appropriate methodology, you end up with unintended consequences. I'm going to jump ahead a couple of questions because we've got some good Q&A going on. So I'm not going to put you, I'm not going to have you put the critical risk, but I am going to jump to this question. So whichever one you want to take the first one, here these things are happening. We've got not just this harmonization, let's keep in mind that right now, for folks that don't know, harmonization means, I think the current Ontario Building Code is something like 60% whatever harmonized already with national, but there still is some significant differences. But we've got harmonization coming. To Mike's point, it's not just on energy, it's everything else. And then you have building code priorities that aren't just energy anymore, it's carbon. And then we move to resiliency. So Mike, Bob, Susan, what are your teams doing to get ready for this? How are you approaching this as a business?
Sure, Andy, I can maybe start off and then Mike and Bob can chime in, because I'll be coming at it from an Enbridge standpoint as the utility that provides the energy for the developments. But we've started going through a full energy transition at Enbridge. So moving away from being simply a natural gas provider to being the energy provider of choice. So it really is something that we're starting to see. We've launched lots and lots of efforts in renewable natural gas and greening the gas that is already in the pipes that are under the ground.
Right.
So we've got RNG, we've got solar PV lease programs available now, which the builders are using for some of the hybrid developments that they're doing. We've got geothermal loop leases where there is no upfront cost to the builder to put in the system. We're trying to address the issues of affordability by keeping the cost away from adding incremental cost to the homes. Right. Even with our community expansion efforts, where we're trying to take communities that are still on propane and oil and things like that and move them to natural gas, because even though it's still a fossil fuel, it's cleaner than the alternative that they're already on. But one of the things that we're also critically aware of is resiliency, and the fact that it is a tough go to look at electrifying the entire province, the cost associated with it, and the impact with some of these major weather occurrences that are happening as well. So how do we achieve keeping natural gas in play as a renewable energy source so that we're reducing all of the impacts, at the same time utilizing the efficiency of the systems that are already here, so we don't have to absorb as a country or a province billions of dollars of new infrastructure that we really can't afford if in the long run we want to address affordability and operational affordability. So those are some of the things that we're working on right now, sort of looking at all of the legs of the stool and how do all of those things come together so that in 2050 we're where we all want to be.
Nice. I know you folks have done a phenomenal job to what you're saying, developing programs that can help builders and developers transition forward, even now with planning. Bob or Mike, what are your teams doing?
So I would say, we're a little bit on the sidelines to see what happens, but I think the most important thing to do, and probably, preaching to the choir here with the participants, because they're here to learn, is the most important thing to do is get educated, understand, and keep up with it.
Yeah.
Because the scope and breadth of the changes there's minor ones, but there's very large significant ones. So every opportunity to learn and be on top of it. And I would dare to say, is certainly for our shop, it's despite the many years of experience, et cetera, we're going to certainly be reliant on building science professionals like the folks at your team at Building Knowledge to help guide us. And I would imagine for the most part, our members, of OHBA across the province will find themselves in that position where, we're just home builders. What do I know about embedded carbon and all these new restrictions and all these other rules and regulations that we have to adhere to? So there's going to be a strong reliance on I'll call the building science community to help lead this. So again, it leads to, does that community then have the capacity to educate and guide and consult our industry for implementation? So educate and be aware of what's happening.
Nice, very nice. Mike.
Changes are coming. We all know how challenging it may have been for some of us. I know with our company, it was a 3-year process to deal with the stair changes that just came into the code.
Yeah.
We had to drop plans, rework plans. There's a lot of work involved there.
Yeah.
Whoever's doing your plans, whoever's involved in that part of your business, whether it's outside partners, you've got to maybe share these slides with them, make them aware that change is coming so that they can be on top of it and get on it as quickly as possible, so that when your new permit applications have to reflect some of these changes, you're ready to go. You did mention we're over 20% houses in Ontario being built to Energy Star standard. So I'd imagine that means over 20% of the houses being built are being built by companies who've partnered with an energy evaluator who are putting foam on their walls. So for those builders who are listening to the seminar, if you don't have an energy evaluator partner, get one, do it now. Have them show you what your houses would look like if you tried to get to Energy Star or Net Zero Ready. Have them do some blower door tests. If you've never done a blower door test, I think I would imagine every builder's done blower door tests, but if you haven't, you must. So partner with an energy evaluator and ask them about embedded carbon. Yeah, net zero.
Yeah,
there you go. All these things. They will help you with that. Have one ready, because there might be a shortage of them. And then when they say, well, we're not taking on new business, well, you've already got one.
Yeah.
Right. But so you need to do that, and you need to do some blower door tests, and you need to build some houses with foam if you haven't. You got to work out the details. When you go to foam, what are you doing with burying for brick on your foundation? What are you doing for racking?
That's right.
And I'll tell you, like, we've done foam on and off for the last 15 years, and it still drives us crazy deciding what to do with our foundations and with racking. So you better start experimenting with it. And when I look at the points-based system, one of the things I have questions about, and you might want to start experimenting with, I haven't heard any conversations on this yet, what do you do with basements? Because, Andy, It's great to show R5 rigid with an R20 bad in front, but what are you going to do for fire in that case? Do you have to now put...
That's right. How do you cover it for Class B thermal barrier? Absolutely.
I've seen no conversations on this, and everybody, not everybody, but many are using just the R20 wrap. That's right. Which are even getting R20, but there's no building officials listening to this, so we're not going to go there. But, what do we do if we have to use rigid with R20, and how does all that work?
Yeah.
You got to figure that part out. And then, it almost feels like what goes around comes around, because if you are going to experiment with foam, well, I feel like, I've pulled out my bell bottoms and my fat ties, because it's like I'm stepping back. You mentioned resiliency at the top of this question.
Yeah.
Once you put foam on a wall, that window leak is not going to dry out in the winter like it
that's right.
Like it always did, saving your butt. You didn't even know that you had a potential disaster because by nature, the dry winter air took away the potential for problems.
That's right.
You take a 3-light casement window, and if the guy didn't put the goop on that little piece of plastic that's attaching the 2 pieces of casement window together, then you've got water falling on the wood sill. And are you doing sill flashing or not? So when I talk about bell bottoms and fat ties, I'm talking about flashing and structure.
Mike, I want to just share something.
Back to that.
I want to share something to your point, and we're going down a building science hole, but I know there's a number that would appreciate this. There are concerns that have been expressed both at the national, provincial level that, you know, before we get adding insulation and doing these all the other things, we need to get some of the basics right. In fact, I have heard our team say to clients, don't even think about adding insulation or tightness until you can drain the rain appropriately.
Yeah.
Until you
have a
understand
little
about
chat-
how to,
have a little
right?
chat with Terry on, and you know more than
That's
most
right.
because you're hired by Terry on to go out and look at all the flashing
That's right.
disasters that
Yeah.
are leading to houses falling apart.
And
it's
so
only
there's a
gonna get
lot
worse.
of things we have to do to get ready for this. And to the other thing too is, you know, let's go down the building science path. Low carbon is good. The thing to remember too is that a lot of low carbon materials are also wood or fiber-based products, which are porous, which now we have materials that also have susceptibility to long-term damage when exposed to water. Not to say you can't build with them, but let's make sure we're managing water correctly before we move too quickly. So that's now
So
I do want to go
experiment with
back.
still pan flashing. Figure out
That's
your
right.
basics. Experiment with foam. Partner with an energy evaluator. This is where you start.
Yeah. So so this is good advice. I think we are going to move over to some questions because we do have some really good statements and some good questions for some folks I do want to share. But I do have to go back to a couple of things. You were talking about energy advisor and so on. And there was a comment over in the chat. I think it was Karen Daniels made the comment. She said, you know, what about challenges? Is there anything that the industry is doing well that would support moving forward? And I think you've answered it, but you haven't, but I'm going to answer it for you. So Karen and others, one thing is that companies like ours, you know, whether it's ClearSphere, Building Knowledge Canada, A&J Consulting, you name it, one of the things that thrills us is we often go see a builder like Mike or Bob at Farsight or Mountain View. We were out to one last week, and they're not a team that's doing Energy Star or has any background, but just wanted us to come out and talk. And so we went out onto site, and lo and behold, the house is at 1.5 air change. Bob, when we came out a year or two ago, you guys were like, well, I don't think we're doing very much. We come out to site and you're exceeding Energy Star standards. You've got a beautiful water resistant barrier on the wall. Your team is so concerned about draining the rain. The air tightness was phenomenal. And the beauty of that conversation was I remember one of your team members was like, so we're that close to like Energy Star and like that close to net zero? Like, yeah, you get there, but you've got the fundamentals correctly. So, you know, kudos to, I'm going to say, professional Ontario home builders like yourself that are in fact doing some basic things well. So let's move over to some of the Q&A if that's okay. We've got some good questions here. And some of them, I don't know if we're able to answer all of them, but we are going to take a couple. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Just hold on just a minute here. And then we're going to move to some questions. Jonathan Ham just had a question there. And again, folks, remember, we'll get back to you if you don't have the answer. Does the code currently specify referencing 936 which version of software is required? So John, if you're asking about the new 936 NBC 2020 tiered, I don't believe there is a reference as to the brand of software. However, 936.5 does speak to what is required of the software and the parameters of the reference house and the modeling protocols. So if you have a software that again has run through the ASHRAE compliance methodology, and you are able to set your parameters and rule sets around it appropriately, you can use it. Again, the next question though is the qualification. So, you know, look for a good registered qualified energy advisor to do that in Part 9 or someone that's experienced. If you're talking about SB 12, Ontario does in fact actually recognize a couple different softwares, HOT 2000, RemRate, Ecotrope, and I think some of the PHP spreadsheets. So Stanley asked a question, is a question about embodied carbon, consideration in the new code being pushed to 2030 and onwards. It's an important element. Shouldn't we introduce this concept to the industry earlier? Giving people time to become comfortable with concepts around embodied carbon. Not to put any of you on the spot, but from what you've learned about embodied carbon, do you feel like it's something we should probably start learning more about now? And yes, we need to start considering it.
Well, I'll jump in. The answer is yes. Because
Okay,
if we're going to go there, we better start introducing sooner than later. Because a lot of this discussion this afternoon is, I mean, the code changes will happen. To what degree will they happen and when? The biggest issue right now is to make sure that they're done properly and we have enough time to adapt. So again, with the issue with the dealing with embodied carbon, if that's going to be part of the narrative going forward at some point in time, the sooner it's introduced, the better, in terms of being prepared for it. What are we looking for? And is the industry prepared?
right, okay. Mike,
Andy, I think the whole embodied carbon discussion is coming to the forefront now, as opposed to in the past, because we're just getting to that level of energy efficiency that it is now becoming the primary consideration, which wasn't the case in the past. And
that's right.
as you
Yeah.
get to Energy Star, that's one thing. Now we go from Energy Star to net zero ready. Embodied carbon starts to become part of the conversation. NBC goes and they put in this tier 5, where now embodied carbon is the entire conversation, but it wasn't addressed when tier 5 was developed. And I think that's all we're going to be talking about going forward, even though it's not there. I think tier 5 is what has ignited the fire in the conversation of embodied carbon. People have always probably known, and there are smart people who understand how to reduce our carbon emissions, and they've been thinking about this for a while. But all of a sudden we have people who may not be as knowledgeable with their hands on the levers of power saying, I want tier 5 in my city. And now's when we have to rally behind these smart people that actually know how to save the planet and say, whoa, are you actually making it better or worse?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. One note, I do want to do a little shout out on this. Interquality is going to be doing a embodied carbon course for builders. It's going to be coming up. I think they're probably going to be putting it out here over the next month or so. So watch out for that. And it's to help with some of these things. You know, it is interesting to think, isn't it? Embodied carbon. And it's not to take away from operational carbon. Right? We know that we can do some work to lower operational carbon. So let's say we could go to with Enbridge's help, we could go to a dual fuel hybrid air source heat pump. Great. And we lower the total operational carbon of a home over 30 years by 80 tons of carbon. Awesome. However, with some simple changes to the materials, we can lower the upfront embodied carbon by, let's say, 20 to 30 tons. Now you'll say 20 to 30 versus 80 seems like 80 is more bigger. Here's the difference. That 20 to 30 tons is now. The climate change goals are within a few years. So that carbon that's today is much more impactful than what's going to be emitted over time. Not that it's not an either or, but it's a prioritizing. So.
And Andy, if I can jump in on that. So we're going to fire up the smokestacks to generate that concrete today. And, you're talking about the carbon that's being generated to heat the home over the years. What happens in 25 years from now with advances in technology? Is the home heating equipment even that much more effective? But we're going to burn all this carbon today, when the energy to heat the house could actually reduce as time goes on, as the equipment changes and the technologies change. And, I don't know if the world's going to be better able to handle that carbon being burnt in 50 years from now compared to now. All I know is now's not the time to be firing up the stacks.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. I want to move on. There was a question Paul Kennedy asked, just more of a technical, and I don't know that we know this. Again, Paul, this would be a good question for the minister. I don't know, Bob or Mike, if you know. He just says, is there any indication from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs about BCIN holders, recertification, new OBC changes coming? Have we heard anything? Have you heard anything? Or
no, the only thing that we've heard is an acknowledgement that it is an issue that needs to be addressed, but
right.
No firm sort of pathway forward. And again, it points towards not necessarily that we want to delay matters for no reason, but that all these pieces, all these components have to be thoughtfully thought out. And what is the path going forward? The BCIN holders, building inspecting community, We talked about building science capacity within the industry. All those things have to be, we've got to look at this as a package.
And I'd like to say that we don't have clarity on this, but one thing that the one feeling that I have gotten is that Ontario, the different players have banded together wonderfully, and you know the chief billing officials, the
Yes.
Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, these people have been wonderful partners to work with to try to get the decisions made right for Ontario. This is a very a big group effort, and we're all pushing in the same way, and it's been wonderful working with these other groups.
I think, Mike, to your comment, in the midst of all of this, which is happening so fast, it makes our head spin. I think your comment reflects what Mike's sealing over in the chat. You know, Mike has been involved with the Ontario building officials for a year, head of buildings in the Tri-City areas there. And Mike, he's sort of the same thing. The development of the EADS form, all of that has been the result of a good collaborative effort of all the industries stepping up, making it happen, as opposed to things just being regulated and handed. So that's nice. Mike Leo, yeah, go ahead, Bob.
I just wanted to add to that, and part of our industries at OHB, our concern was that, as you're probably aware of, and others are as well, Andy, to that point, is that this code cycle doesn't appear to have the same robustness in terms of consultations and opportunities, just because there's this push to the finish line quickly, that we don't have enough time to that. So we're working, I mean, under Mike's leadership, you know, in the committee, and you're a member of that committee, as you're well aware, that to, you know, open the door and have these discussions. We have to have these discussions and work together. So, you know, we're working towards that goal.
Yes, absolutely. Mike Leo, it's good to have you on there, Mike. Mike asked a question, and it's a little background for folks. Many of you would know Mike. Mike is a good friend of the industry. He's on the same committee that Bob is talking about. Those of you that don't know, I consider Mike a good friend, someone to talk to that knows the background of building science and everything else. But Mike also was deeply involved with the development of the SB12 as a consultant, and did a really nice job working with the ministry and the OBOA and others on doing this. And Mike asked a really important question, and I think it's one that it has to be looked at now. But he said, you know, Andy, this national tiered energy code, it seems to ignore the cost of energy, again, electricity versus natural gas, and building into requirements, unlike SB12, because when SB12 was formed, it did look at those cost implications. So for instance, if you do all you have to do is go to SB12, and if you go with an all electric home, what else do you have to do? You have to invest in the envelope, because they don't want you to end up with a house that's going to cost thousands of dollars more to heat and operate just because you went to a different fuel. So really good point. You know, Mike talks about, after all, consumers are concerned about operating costs rather than how many gigajoules they used. And it's true, right? At the end of the day, folks are going to be looking at this. So that is something I do know that, you know, these are the kinds of things that, for instance, the ministry is looking at. Mike, I'm going to ask some questions around that and get back to you, but thanks for bringing that point up, because it's incredibly important. You know, it's interesting to us, for instance, in Alberta, to Mike's point, we worked on some projects with a builder that built some net zero all electric homes about 8 years ago, and they were wonderful, cool houses, low gigajoules, solar, you know, air source heat pumps, state of the art, cold climate, but they cost more to operate than the code built homes with natural gas. And again, that's hard to explain to the homeowner. So we've got to figure that out. To Mike's point, we've got to look at that and the affordability.
And Andy,
Zoran,
just before we wrap that point up, because one of the interesting things that we have been looking at is the Fortis model in BC, where they are just, you know, looking at announcing that all residential new construction will be offered renewable natural gas.
Interesting.
So right across the board, so that if you're building a new home in British Columbia, it will be given renewable natural gas. So it's a complete offset immediately. So options like that, because we don't have to change a thing. We've got the pipes in the ground. You've got the gas. We just have to raise the level of renewable natural gas, and we can address the issue without putting in, another electricity tower or trying to get any more capacity built into the system. So really looking at the affordability issue, along with the resiliency issue of what's buried under the ground doesn't get impacted with the weather permits,
Right.
the weather, the same way that things above ground do. So those two options right now are something that we're really, really interested in trying to make sure that affordability remains forefront, both before, both for the builders and for the people that are trying desperately to afford their mortgages and their operating costs going forward. So all good points.
Yeah. Just a couple more questions we have here. Zoran just said, what about existing homes? A third of greenhouse gases, he says, come from buildings we use right now. 70% will be standing in 2050. It is, that's something, Bob, Mike, Susan, you've all said, the new industry is being pushed along. What about those homes that exist, the homes we live in today? Any comments around that?
Well,
Mike? Bob?
Yeah, I would say there's certainly big room for improvement as you look at it, because if you look at the whole spectrum of greenhouse gases being emitted, actually, as we're getting more and more and more efficient with new builds, I call it we're squeezing that last bit of juice out of the lemon, right?
Yes, that's right.
And then you look, lo and behold, the existing community, the homes that were built 50s, 60s, even in the 70s and earlier as well. I mean, they're spewing out greenhouse gases like crazy. So, what are the opportunities to reduce that? And quite frankly, if governments are making investments, they should be looking at, that's a low-hanging fruit. They should be looking at how can we incentivize existing homeowners in a very meaningful way to implement measures to reduce that.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Andy, just to follow up on Bob, we're working very closely with the governments right now to find partnership opportunities where we can assist with those pilots. We've got 150 units in infill homes in London that are running on air source heat pumps as a pilot right now, finding ways to bring that new technology to market and finding ways to make that incentivized by the government and by ourselves to make it as easy as possible for those that are in current homes. So, we're just as focused on the demand side management for infill homes as we are for what Bob was just referring to, that last little bit of lemon juice we've got there for the new home builders as well. But a really big part of our success going forward is current stock.
Yeah. So Bob and Mike, I'll put you on the spot a little bit. From the Ontario home builders position, we have this federal mandate that has come down, I think earlier this year, about the wanting to require an energy label, if you will, for homes, existing homes. We have the city of Toronto that's advancing that, Vancouver, a number of others that are saying, if you're going to sell your existing home, we want you to recognize the energy efficiency through an audit for the purchaser. What is your take on that?
Well, I'll jump in first. I think it's a good idea. Mm-hmm. Why, homeowners or prospective buyers should understand what the energy performance is of a home to make proper, their proper decisions in their home buying decisions. And it also would put to the forefront really where investments could be made to improve that, right?
Oh, yes, that's right. Yeah.
So you bring that to the forefront, and hypothetically, if a home scores low, there's perhaps an incentive to improve that dramatically to increase the value of the home. You're actually making an investment not only in your home, but ultimately an investment in improving, towards improving climate change and resiliency as well.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
I know it's a controversial subject.
It is.
for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I appreciate you saying that. So,
but however, we need a level playing field here.
that's right.
And I think disclosure and information is good.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Andy, we've got the two branches there, the new construction, the existing residential, and you go to tier 3, the houses are pretty much all going to be built to an Energy Star standard or greater. So we already know that they're, you know, in a tight range of whatever energy rating you're going to use. You're going to have a rough idea that this is where this new home is going to come onto the market at. Not showing up as a label in the house. Should we be spending the extra money for the label or not? Once we're all doing blower door tests, we've got someone in the house that's doing that part of it. It's already now becoming part of the price. I think the biggest question for this one, though, which you brought up with the existing stock, how do you get that existing stock to the next level? Will homeowners be able to get enough savings on their, you know, let's say they're going to live in a house for 10 or 20 years and they're going to spend $40,000 to make the house more energy efficient? Is that a reasonable payback or not? And I feel like the only way you're really going to get homeowners to start to make these energy efficiency upgrades in the existing stock is if they're getting something back from the government, like you know, there's a program right now, and there's been multiple programs that have been
Greener
done.
homes.
Yeah, and it's either like municipally with your property tax or something from the provincial or federal government. And you know what? Most likely an energy evaluation before and after some energy upgrades are done should probably be part of that process if you're going to get money back from the government.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. No, thank you guys for it. Didn't mean to put you on that. By the way, for everybody, we did not tell Mike and Bob we were going to ask that question, Susan. So we had a couple other things come in on the chat. Just a point, Donald Fast just commented. He said, actually, the city of Vancouver is requiring improved efficiency for renovations. For major renovations, they require more, and it's on a point system. So it's sort of interesting. Susan, there was sort of a question for you, and I don't know if you can answer this or point to a website. I think it's more, so just a quick question. Jim said, what percentage of renewable natural gas will be made available to homeowners as a fossil fuel? Do you have any sense about that?
Well, I think the goal right now is for us to continue to build the capacity. I mean, that's an awful lot of the effort that we're doing right now with farms and municipalities and those types of things, and trying to get the capacity built because the desire is there to use it. Right now, we're at a relatively low capacity. I know we're shooting for, you know, for a percentage increase in the next little while, but everything just depends on the development of getting those contracts in play to be able to create it. It's already there. The methane is there. We just need to be able to, you know, to find a way to work with it and that sort of thing. And the other thing that we're very involved in too is the hydrogen blending as well. We've got the hydrogen facility up in Markham and looking at ways with RNG, hydrogen blending. How do we get the percentage of what's in the pipe carbon reduced?
Isn't it interesting that over the span of 3 weeks, the whole hydrogen conversation, because of the Germany situation, the Ukraine, has completely changed in our country, right? Like how fast these things happen. I do see a couple other, but I don't know if we'll be able to answer these, Jim. We might have to get back to you. I'll talk to you, Susan. Just wondering some deeper understanding of greenhouse gas emissions, the difference between renewable natural gas and natural gas. You know, we could send Jim a website if you have any information on that.
For sure. Absolutely.
Okay. So Jim, we'll try to prepare some of that. So good questions, folks. Good comments. We've made them through the questions. Mike, Bob, Susan, thank you so much. This has been a really good session. Parting comments, and we'll start with Susan. Anything you want to leave us with?
Yeah, I think it's a point that both Bob and Mike made, which is take advantage of all of the training and education that's available. You know, take part in the residential savings by design programs. These programs are free and there's incentives that are tied to them. join the training that either Building Knowledge or anybody is putting on right now, and engage. Don't wait for it to happen. I think that's really the most important message I want to leave people with, is learn now, build your discovery homes, make your mistakes, and be prepared, because it's an inevitable thing, and it's coming.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. Bob?
A couple of things. I think Susan stole my thunder a little bit. Is educate and be prepared for sure. And what's tethered to that too is, and as Mike alluded to, and I've spoken earlier, is get aligned with the building science people like yourselves, Andy, at Building Knowledge, and your colleagues. And there's others as well. I know Michael Leo's in that space, and there's others certainly in the industry. But you're going to need guidance to overcome what's coming forward. And for the most part, and I'll speak for our company, we need that guidance to make sure that we can accomplish those goals at the end of the day. So I think for me, that's the best advice I could give. I want to also take the opportunity to thank you, Andy, for organizing this, and Susan and Enbridge and your team for, I know you've done many of these webinars and supported it, and are supported OHBA and our members going forward. So thank you very much for that. And especially to you then personally, Andy, since you're celebrating your 50th birthday today,
Oh.
to take the time out to help and educate all of the participants today, a heartfelt thanks for that.
You're so
way to go, Bob.
Mike,
I think most builders in Ontario are probably somewhat prepared for especially the energy part of the changes. That's what we focused on with this webinar, obviously. But if you haven't, talk to an energy evaluator, find out what changes you'd need to make to get to Energy Star or Net Zero ready on the houses that you're building. Put some foam on a house to see how that goes. Look at the flashing, how you're flashing your houses once you're getting into the foam. Do some blower door tests to see where you are, so that if you can take that approach to get the points that you need to get to these levels in tier 3 that you're likely going to be dealing with in 24 months. And I think the last thing, there hasn't been a lot of information available on meat and potatoes. What does this actually mean? And even from OHBA's perspective, we don't even have concrete information to send out yet. And so check your spam box, like your junk mail box in your email, and just watch for NBC, National Building Code changes, because all of a sudden these things are going to hit, and you're going to have to get on it right away. It's not one of those things that you put in the back of your mind, I'll look at it in 6 months. No, you're likely going to have a short runway for whatever does end up becoming solid and a necessary change.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Mike. Well, listen, folks, thank you very much. For those of you that are on the presentation today, thank you for your time. Thanks for the good questions and the interaction. I'm going to leave you with a little bit of a quote, and it reflects everything you just heard from Susan, Bob, and Mike. I don't know if many of you can remember being forced to read Future Shock by Alvin Toffler when you were in high school. But Alvin, in this book that was written, Toffler identified what was called the illiterate of the 21st century. And the reason I bring this quote up is because you've all talked about this desperate need that as builders and industry partners, we have to become learning corporations, or we're not going to survive. And one of the things Toffler said in that book is, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And I think that's a sharp, very drastic message for us, but I love what you folks are doing, because you're doing it in spades. So thanks for the good example. Thank you today for your help. And we're going to wrap up with a couple last slides for today. So we have coming up, folks, just so you know, on let me just move along here. We've got a quick note as we sign off today. We've got a Builder Digest. If you haven't signed up for the Builder Digest, please do. All of these sessions are available. There's articles, there's a digest that comes out 3 or 4 times a year. The next sessions that are going to be offered by Enbridge, we've got another critical Canadian building science coming up. It's going to be Gord Cook and Justin Wilson talking about high performance mechanicals and ventilation. And yes, it's going to be about what you're going to need to do if you're not doing it already in your higher tier homes, these net zero homes. The other one too is Enbridge has another training coming up. I think it's one of the last, construction heat appliance and commissioning training. Believe it or not, folks, we're part of the way through summer. Cold weather's coming. This is really important for builders that are working in Ontario over the winter. So again, thank you so much for your time today. You will receive recordings of the presentation. Please fill out the survey and get it back to us. And again, I want to give a really heartfelt thank you to Bob Schickedanz, Mike Memme, and Susan Cudahy for a great session today. Thank you, folks, and enjoy your Thursday afternoon.